What is up, players? It's Warboss Tay up in this mug. Welcome to my first tutorial in quite a long time. I'm going to be painting up this Gutrippa from the Orruk War Clan's army, and I'm going to only be using the paints that were included in the Gutrippaz and Paints set for those of you who actually went out and sprang for that product. And if you didn't, if you actually have a full set of paints, then stay tuned. I'm going to be doing a follow-up, an additional tutorial where we'll actually bring it up. But as you can see from the box cover, it looks like they only did base coats and shades, and they didn't really do any highlighting, which is okay, because if you're only talking about getting your models up to a tabletop quality, then everything you have in this box will get you to this step, no problem. And you can see from the timestamp that it takes me quite a while to paint this one guy, but if you're actually assembly lining these models, it won't take you too long. If I would add anything, it would only be a bone color for the Orruk teeth and possibly another brown to break up that Steel Legion drab is a great color for the wood and some of the cloth, but maybe I would do like a black cloth for maybe the hoods, or do like a Mornfang brown so you get a different color, like more of a reddish brown. Maybe even a Dryad bark, or a, gosh, what was that other one? I can't remember off the top of my head now. Dryad bark or Rhinox hide, those are nice dark brown colors, just to break it up. And that would be the only thing I would change though. Everything else is pretty much doable. The good thing about the Gutrippaz and Orruk War Clans evil armies, quote unquote evil armies in general, is that you don't really need to do much more than base coats and shades. But yeah, if I were to go back, I would use that Rakarth flesh to, I think that's the only thing that's really missing, because when you look at these guys, some of them, most of them have fangs that they're snarling or baring their teeth or they're screaming. It's the one thing you don't really see. Orcs in the past, you see their fangs or their fingernails or their toes more. These guys can pretty much get away with what you have. So the first step after you build your guys up is to spray prime them. I use this Army Painter spray primer for all of them, and the great thing about using a color primer, guys, I think I'm pretty much done with using gray, black, or white primers. I'm just gonna go with a color primer. It saves so much time, because the majority of the models are going to be one color. You just choose the color that works the best. So even though these guys have a lot of skin showing, they do have hoods, and they do have a lot of different textures and materials. You can see they have bandages and wrappings around their legs, and a lot of different colors that are not going to be that green, which would take a lot more time to paint those fiddly bits in some kind of brown color. So get that out of the way right now. Plus the brown is perfect for the spear shafts, as well as any cloth, hoods, bandages, wrappings, even the straps that hold their like belts, or that hold their knives or other things to them. So I was debating whether or not to paint them, to spray prime them in brown or their skin color. In the end, I went with leather brown, which is a pretty comparable color to Steel Legion drab. It's not exact, but this game store that I bought this primer from didn't have the Games Workshop colors that I needed, so I went with this one. And I think this is the only product that I use that is not a part of the Orruks and Paints sets, and you have to use a primer. You can't just prime your models in Steel Legion drab. Trust me, if you're a new painter, you can't do that. You need to have a spray primer. It will help the colors adhere to your models so much better. So here we go. This is what they look like. And if you're not familiar with priming your models, you just want to hold them about an arm's length away. Always prime outside because of the chemicals and the smell. You need proper ventilation. It was raining a little bit, so I just opened up the garage door. I wasn't exactly outside, but you want to have enough ventilation that spray primer isn't going to be sitting in the air and getting into your lungs. So because the sound was all messed up when my microphone was crackling and giving really bad feedback. I'm gonna just kind of guess at what I was doing. So here is the clamshell pack from the Squig Herd. I'm gonna practice what I preach by pouring some of my paint water into the bottom, and I'm gonna make a wet primer live on video right now. I'm just taking a paper towel, and don't use Kleenex because Kleenex can sometimes be covered in chemicals and different perfumes and stuff. So you want to use a nice paper towel, cut that sucker in half, fold it up. And the trick with these wet palettes, something that I didn't learn till I was really using them more frequently, was that if you have too much water in your wet palette and it pools on the top, then that is going to seriously dilute and spread out your paint. You just want enough wetness there and dampness on the cloth so that it will have the paint adhere, stick to, and then sink into the paper towel. If you hear any chirping, that's my little parrot, Merlin. I just got home from work and I'm letting him fly around, so sometimes he sits on me while I do my videos. Okay, what was I talking about? Yeah, you can use your wet palette. Seriously, I filmed this and I painted these guys last night, and the wet palette is still usable. I might have to cut the tape if he starts chirping too much, so sorry for the noise, guys. All right, the first color we're using is Mephiston Red, and I'm going to shake it up. With all of these paints, anytime you have a new pot of paint, you always want to shake it up and get it all mixed in the pot before you break that seal and open it. So I realized when I was painting, I was so focused on getting the angle right and getting the model in frame. There goes my bird. That I forgot to actually use my wet palette. So that was a great start to this video. Yeah, you never want to paint straight from the pot, and putting it on your wet palette will help the paint to spread out and be more usable, spread more easily on the model, and not be as thick and clumpy on your brush. Hey, whatever you guys are working on out there, I hope you enjoy painting with me. It's always fun to see a model start from nothing, and I am not changing the time speed of this video at all. I'm really just letting the camera run, and that's what all these tutorials are about, is just making the model go from, I guess, a primered state to fully painted. And I hope whatever you're working on is going to be a productive time for you as well. So thanks for joining me. Now, when painting on the shield, it's really simple to just paint on the front. Forget that you also have to paint the rim as well as the rear of the shield. Now, it looks like the straps for the shield are made of some kind of cloth. If I were to add a color, I would probably paint them black. Red and black go really well together, and there's enough brown on this model already. I think painting black straps onto the arms of the model here for the shield would be a good move. I hear Merlin. I put him away in his cage, but I hear him chirping and eating his food. So, okay, here I remember talking about the ferrule. If you dip your paint brush too deeply into the paint when trying to mix it or just using it in general, it could damage your brush if that paint gets into the ferrule. The ferrule is the little area where the metal wrapping meets the bristles. And I've said this before, but for new painters and even for experienced painters, it's really easy to forget how easy it is to get paint in there and then have it dry there, and then that just splits your bristles and makes your brush pretty much unusable unless you get it cleaned. Basically what I'm saying is you only need paint on the very tip of your brush. Another reason why we use these wet palettes is because if you get paint on even the tip of your brush, but it's straight from the pot, it could be a big glob like a lollipop. And if you're trying to paint a large area, such as the skin, we're using this Orruk green for the skin. If you have a big glob of that Orruk green on the tip of your brush because you're trying to cover that large area, the instant you touch it to the model and start trying to spread it around, it could get dangerously close or even into the ferrule, which would ruin your brush. I believe Orruk green, I'm not sure if it says it's a base or a layer paint, but it really works like a layer paint. I consider it very close to Skarsnik green. Skarsnik green is a very thin paint, so when you use it, it will spread, it will streak, and the only solutions for that are shaking the pot really well to make sure that streakiness isn't caused by the paint having separated in the pot. And even after you shake it, you could get some of that paint stroke streakiness that we don't want. So using a wet palette to thin it down will definitely help when you're putting on your first layer. And you can see the primed brown underneath sticking out, or peeking through rather, and that's okay. Paint on one layer, even if it's one thin layer and it starts to spread, let it dry. Don't keep adding paint. The worst thing you can do at this stage with a thin layer paint like Orruk green is to keep adding more paint because you want to cover that area. I know it's tempting. I make that mistake a lot myself, but try to resist doing that. If you can discipline yourself to paint one layer at a time, even if it starts streaking and spreading, and if you see the underlying color underneath, just have a little bit of patience, let it dry, and then you can add that second coat. Believe me, once you put that second coat on, it will pretty much cover any mistakes or any of the underlying paint peeking through from that first layer. And guys, don't be afraid to experiment, and sometimes the hardest thing to do is to just pick up a brush. And I know how easy it is to get really indecisive and to second guess yourself, especially when it comes to paints and paint schemes. Sometimes you could be looking at a model and think you want to paint it one way, and all of a sudden your inspiration, your creativity just flies out the window. You start to become insecure or paranoid about the paints you're using. And I know it's easy to just give up. And that's why we have so many unpainted models in our piles of potential. But sometimes all it takes is just sitting down and putting the paint to the model. Once you put it on, whether it's right, whether it's wrong, whether you realize later you probably should have painted it something else, the hardest step is putting paint on the model. So do that. Always do that. Right now I'm working on the torso, and you saw that I did the shield arm. Having a handle will help a lot. I think I was really excited to paint and film, so I didn't have my cork handle that I always have. But whether it's a model holder, like if you get a fancy Games Workshop handle that clamps on the base, or whether it's a piece of cork that you have some blue tack or some putty on the top that will stick it, or you could use like a prescription pill bottle or an empty paint pot. It's doing what I'm doing right now. This is the worst thing you can do for your fingers. This is how I painted 100 night goblins with tiny 20 millimeter square bases, and holding those flat bases between 3 fingers with one hand for hours on end. I think it's probably done some permanent damage to my fingers. So don't do what I'm doing. I was being very overzealous about getting the camera rolling and painting for you guys. And I'm probably not going to do this again. I'm probably going to definitely... I got to learn how to speak again. I will definitely find a handle to use to paint my models in the future. Yeah, so the reason I brought that up was because if you have your model on a handle or a clamp or something, you can turn it in different directions and different angles. Sometimes we get so focused on looking at our model from the front or from a top down from the front that we forget to peek underneath. Look at the guy's armpits, and you're gonna see, oh, I forgot to completely paint the inside of his arm that you never see because it's holding the shield up. And it's okay if you miss some parts, but the worst feeling is when you're taking your models out for display or to play a game and you realize that you missed an entire section because you didn't think to hold it at a certain angle. So look at that, that's only 2 colors after the primer, and already we could see the general shape of the model, how it's gonna look once it's painted. And that's why this part I saved, the metallic, the silver, lead belcher till now. This is really just the last base color we're going to be working with. So lead belcher is a great paint. It covers really nicely and evenly. If you put it on your wet palette, if you get it too wet and diluted, it will spread out. And it's one of the paints that I think doesn't need to be on a wet palette as much. Maybe a little bit of moisture so that it doesn't get all clumpy, but definitely it is not a paint you need to worry about. If you paint it straight from the pot, I think as long as you spread it, then it will give good coverage. On these models, there's not much silver. There is the tip of the weapon and the bottom. There are some round little studs on their shields, and there are some larger plates that they use to protect their knees and their shoulders, but they don't have chest armor. They don't have any kind of chainmail underneath the cloth. So this is really a great figure for new painters to paint. I think for a starter set, Dominion is a really good starter set for a new painter, because the Stormcast Eternals, man, they're so easy to paint, as well as these grots. In fact, I would suggest if you're a brand new painter and you've never painted any Warhammer figures before in your life, what you need to start are the starter set, the Minion, or any of the starter sets where the models, maybe you have less models, but it's more affordable. And you need some super glue, or plastic glue rather. You need some clippers and a hobby knife, some paintbrushes, of course. But all you need paints wise, for sure, are for the Orruks, the colors pretty much that come in the Gutrippaz and Paints set. Don't get the Sterling Mud. That's a waste of money. Get yourself a good acrylic black from a hobby store. You don't have to get Abaddon black. And maybe get some texture paint from a hobby store, like a train store or something. Vallejo makes a great texture paint that you could paint on the base. It'll dry, and you can get a lot for really cheap. And yeah, that's really, I would say, like 4 or 5, 6 paints. You don't need to get the whole, I think Games Workshop is trying to sell on bundles of paints that include like 20 different colors. You don't need that much, especially for starting. What you need is a good primer, a good colored primer. And for the Gutrippas, I would suggest the leather brown, or any kind of brown primer that looks like Steel Legion Drab. Speaking of Steel Legion Drab, let's pop that bad boy back open. And I'm talking about how I was a little bit messy with my greens and my silvers. And the great thing about these models, it's really easy to see where you have some bleed over. And even if I don't go back with my Steel Legion Drab like I'm going to do right now to fix my mistakes, the Agrax Earthshade is going to pretty much cover any mistakes you make. This is more because I want to not have to worry later about my mistakes showing through the shade. But the shade step of the process, really, if you're a new painter, the shade will just add and enhance your model so much. It's really, really going to make you feel like it's talent in a bottle is what we used to call it. Now, the important step before using Agrax Earthshade is when you're cleaning up your model, like I'm doing here. After you're done cleaning and you're ready for the shade step, you have to let your model sit. You have to let the paint dry. And go on to paint something else or build something else, do something else. If your paint is still wet and you add the shade, it's going to really mess up a whole chunk, maybe even the whole model. Especially if your silver or your gold paints are still wet, because what that does is the shade will dilute and spread and take all that glittery, shiny pigment of the metallic paints and spread them across the model. Definitely don't want that. But what I was saying earlier was get yourself a good colored primer, and don't get a black or white primer. I would suggest brown for the Orruks if you're going to collect them, or get Retributor Armor spray primer for when you build up your Stormcast Eternals. And it might look a little weird because the scenic bases and the bases themselves are going to be this glittery gold, but you can go back over everything with a different paint, and it's just going to take off so much time from having to paint on that base color of gold. What I used to do was when I would paint my ogres, I remember I used to paint over all the areas that would be gold. I used to paint them in Mornfang brown first as like a base coat for the gold to go over, because the shining gold back in the day didn't cover nearly as well as Agrax Earthshade does. Or I'm sorry, as Retributor Armor Gold does now. You can see that I'm shaking up my Agrax Earthshade. If your Agrax Earthshade sits for too long, if any of your shade paints sit for too long, they will separate. And when you try to paint using only the top, it's going to be really oily. It's going to create a very shiny and oily finish. And sometimes even if you shake your paint up, you're going to have that as well. You can see I painted up all of my Gutrippas up to this standard, so I'm kind of having everything going at the same pace, so that you can see the progress for all of them. Man, just a couple of nights ago, they were still on the sprue, not even built yet, and look at that, just after a half hour's worth of work, maybe a little bit more, all of them are all painted up and ready for the shades. I think it was at this point when I realized, oh, my paint is still wet on this guy with the big shield. I hadn't let it dry all night. I was so excited to get going that I just kind of let him continue drying while I went back to this first guy. And I think at some point I'm going to remember I have to paint there are some silver studs on the shield that need to be painted with lead belcher, but yeah, it looks like I don't remember it just yet. These models I painted in between working on my Kingdom Death commission, and it's good sometimes to have a palette cleanser like this. These guys are so low engagement. My brain was almost on autopilot working on these models because Kingdom Death is so detailed, and a lot of models you're going to paint have lots of detail and fiddly bits, and these starter sets are made almost specifically so that a newer, inexperienced painter can paint them without worrying about lots of different textures or colors. You don't have to worry about more than 4 colors with this Orruk you're going to see. So I'm starting from the bottom, and with any shade paint you use, you can use either Agrax Earthshade, or you can take a dark brown paint like Rhinox Hide or Dryad Bark. That's the other one I was trying to think of. And you can use Lamian Medium to thin it down and still make it usable as a wash. I think you can use water, just a lot of water, to thin down those paints as well. Use that as a wash, but I'm using Agrax Earthshade because it came with a paint set and it's what a lot of people are familiar with. Really though, I do suggest using Lamian Medium to thin down a base paint like Dryad Bark or Rhinox Hide. It creates pretty much the same effect, and you have no danger of it finishing with this oily residue that I just can't stand. I've used so much Agrax Earthshade, and before this, in the old range, it was called Devlin Mud was the shade color, and I think when it switched over to Agrax, that's when people started noticing they used some different way of making the paint, so it ended up looking really shiny. And yeah, like I said, a lot of that shininess will be cut down if you really shake your paint, but some of it is just going to be, it's just going to end up like that because that's just how the paint is. The trick with using Agrax Earthshade or any shade is that you want to move the color around on the model. If it pools, especially in a large surface area like the small of his back or his loincloth there, if it pools, then it's going to dry like a puddle, and it's going to create an unnatural shadow. So you want gravity to drag the shade down the model to get into all the cracks and crevices between the textures, like between the skin and the cloth, between the cloth and the armor. You do want a little bit of that shade lining those areas to give a little bit of shadow, but you don't want enough to pool in any area that it's going to create a puddle. That's a good word I'm looking for, a puddle. If you have a puddle of shade, it's going to dry and end up leaving a very unnatural splotch of darkness on your model. Yep, we're just painting our model to the barest minimum for a tabletop quality. I think you really need to just get to the shade stage. Base coats are okay, but you can tell if an army is base coated, it looks really unfinished, almost like toys, really cheaply made toys that don't have a lot of depth to their coloring. You could tell when you see it on the table. But this shade paint, this step in the process, really elevates your model and makes it come alive almost. Now, to progress even further and to elevate your models even further, that's when you start adding in the effects. Like I would add some rust, some orangey rust. I would add, like I said, the teeth before. And there are a lot of little tips and techniques you can do, little tiny things like rust around the bolts and the teeth and maybe the claws and the toes, talons, to make your model stand out. So what I'm doing now is I'm using the included Sterling mud that came with the Gutrippaz and Paints set. But as I mentioned before, a better alternative would be to spend the $4 or $5 to get a Vallejo pot of texture paint. And now I think AK Miniatures, AK Interactive, makes a texture paint that's just as good, and it goes on wet. You can don't use your brush, but you could use some other kind of applicator, or maybe an old brush, or I wouldn't say a Q-tip because you don't want all of that fiber to come off, but maybe an old paintbrush. Slap that texture paint onto the model, give it some realistic depth and piles all over the base, and then when it dries, it's going to dry almost like sand or compacted earth. And then you would paint over that the different colors of your base, maybe add some grass. Just as this is, look at how terrible this is, guys. The grains of the texture paint are so small, it creates no effect on the base whatsoever. The only way that I could enhance the top of this base would be to take a lot of that texture paint, that Sterling mud, and just slap it on until it makes like piles. And once that's dry, then you could try to color it differently or add some grass. But really, it's Sterling mud. All of their technical colors or paints for the bases, they just don't work. It's so much more price efficient to go with one of those. Like I said, Vallejo makes a great texture paint. AK is a little bit more expensive, but their texture paint is terrific. And yeah, you see, you can't even tell that there's a texture paint on the top of the base. Now, like I said, I'm only working with the colors that are in the Gutrippaz and Paints set. And oh, look, my cork. So this is what I was talking about earlier, guys. It's a cork handle. I got it at a hobby store in the art section. And I've got some blue tack on the top of that. Now, the blue tack is going to be tricky to find because I don't think anybody uses blue tack anymore. I haven't seen it at all the places where I would normally find it. You might need to go on eBay or find some other way of acquiring it, but it's basically poster tack that you stick on the wall instead of using a nail or a piece of tape. So because I'm using only the paints that were included in the Gutrippa set, I have to use Steel Legion Drab to paint the rim. And I lost a lot of paint doing this with my Night Goblins and my Orcs and Goblins. Not only because Steel Legion Drab, when you paint the rim, sometimes it'll bleed over to the top of the rim. Then you have to get your Sterling Mud back out and you have to clean up the edge. But also because the Steel Legion Drab itself it doesn't show up that well on black. So it'll spread and you can see the streakiness and the black base popping through. You have to go over with a second coat, and if you're impatient like I am and you're just slapping that paint on to get coverage, then you're going to end up with lots of uneven surfaces on the side of your base, and that's not what you want, especially because when you're moving your models around on the tabletop, that paint will very easily rub off because we don't want to touch our models, right? We don't want to rub the paint off of our models. So a lot of time we grab our models by the base, by the rim. And guess what happens when you do that over and over and over again? The oils on your fingers and the friction is just going to rub that brown off. So a better alternative is to use an acrylic paint that you can get for really, really cheap at any hobby store, paint store. I've got a tub of it that I'm going to show you. I'm pretty sure that's what I'm about to do. I'm looking for this tub of black acrylic paint, and I think I got it for maybe $2 or $3, and it's the amount is equivalent to maybe 6 or 7 or 8 pots of Abaddon black. But just look at the size of this tube right here, this jar, this plastic bottle of of black paint, and it's just as good as Abaddon black. I think I mentioned it in this video that I got rid of the audio for, but black, guys, black is black across the board. Black paint doesn't need to be the exclusive premium Games Workshop $6 for a little pot black. It's not like these other colors where you might want a specific shade that Games Workshop does. You might want to have the exact color, like your brain knows a Games Workshop color, and you want to use that because you're a fanboy, or maybe it's the only paint you can get. Maybe you get these paints and your supplies from a Games Workshop store. But you don't need to do it with the black, with the white, or if you're painting like a lot of your bases, don't waste your expensive Dryad Bark and Steel Legion Drab painting up the layers on the bases. Get a couple of different shades of browns. Like these paints right here, you don't need these colors for painting hundreds of bases because you're going to go through them so fast. Get yourself a couple tubs of different colors of acrylic paint. The paint that we're using on our models is acrylic paint. So I believe Alternative Artist, who did the Warboss Tape Painting Challenge, had done a series where she used only hobby store acrylic paints and saved so much money. And so I highly recommend it, guys. Get yourself some cheap black acrylic paint. Stop paying these prices, man. With this inflation and prices going through the roof already, we're playing a luxury game here. So we want to cut corners where we can, save some of that money so you can use it to buy more little plastic green men. And yeah, that's it, guys. That's what I was using. All of the products that I was using, I used the starter brush that came here. I used only the paints that were included in this set, and I think it came out pretty well. All three of these guys standing next to each other, they look pretty good for only having base colors and then shades. And I think that's a commendation for Games Workshop. They designed these Orruk models to look really good just with base colors and paints. So that's gonna wrap it up here, guys. I don't think there's anything more in the video that I can show you that really needs to be a focus on. I think I'm talking here about how I did a YouTube short with this guy. And oh, this is where I realized that these guys have little silver studs on their shields, so I'm going to try to paint them on. But while I do that, I hope you enjoyed painting with me. I know it's a chore to sit down, get your butt in the chair, and like I said, just put paint on the model, but I hope that seeing my guys come up from nothing is, if not exciting, it's as exciting as watching paint dry. I hope that it was entertaining enough, and I hope the music was droning and soothing enough in your ear that you were able to put your brain on autopilot, just listen to my voice and work on your models and get some progress done. We all want models painted up to as high of a quality standard as we can make it. And I think my philosophy in painting has changed over the years, because I've changed over the years. And before, I wanted to really focus on my artistry and paint beautiful miniatures. And I think now that I'm a father and I see how many miniatures I have in my garage, my focus is now turning to how quickly can I paint all of the stuff that I have so that I can get through them and maybe give them to my son to inherit, or maybe sell them on eBay so I can make a profit so I can buy things for my son. And it's funny how this hobby has gone from something that I was happy to just collect armies and armies and armies for, and now I want to look forward to having them help in my life with my family and raising my son and stuff like that. Okay, that's enough pontificating. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you were able to get some work done on your own models. Stay tuned. Like I said, if I can, I would like to give these guys the full War Boss Day treatment, where we take the model and take the colors, bring them back up to a nice highlighted stage, maybe even add those technical bits like I mentioned, the rust on the silver. Oh, maybe even some blue verdigris on the red to offset the red. If I could do some verdigris and some corrosion in there, I think that would look really cool on the shield. And we will also do some eyeballs, get some nice red eyeballs and some teeth, maybe some toes and fingernails. And definitely repaint the brim of that base, because, oh, that thing looks terrible. All right, thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you in the next one. Hey, thanks for watching the video, everyone. If you'd like to join our Discord, we have such a great community over there. People posting up pictures of their works in progress, their finished projects, and just chatting about the hobby and life in general. It's a great place to be, so head on over there. Links in the description. If you'd like to support the studio, then check out the link to Igor's Trade House, where you can get merchandise at a 10% discount by entering the code HOBBYTON at checkout. And finally, I want to say thank you to my patrons, Daniel Sprinkle, Pix, Dicey Guy, Play It Painted, Ception, and David Moffat. Thanks for supporting my studio, guys. If you'd like to join them, you can head over to the Patreon link and support me through there. Again, thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day.